Welcome to Driftwood Guitars. My name is Chris. Behind the camera is Matt. As always, and it's another episode of the 3,000-year-old guitar build. And what we have in front of us right here is the guitar with 15 coats of lacquer on it. We spent about 10 days applying all of the finish, and then it has been drying for longer than it needs to, right, Matt? It's probably been drying for about 3 or 4 weeks.
Okay, so listen, I'm gonna just go. I just want to say this part out loud. It is easier, 2 weeks is like the minimum, but if you let it dry longer, it does make a difference in the final product. To be honest, we've had other irons in the fire. That's why we haven't done it. But yeah, no,
I do. I get excited sometimes when like the guitar is ready for buff out and you realize it's been hanging up drying for like over a month, because I know that the lacquer is super dry. So if you did spray lacquer on your guitar and you have an opportunity to let it dry longer, do that. And that's where we are with it right now.
Ooh, I wanted to also bring up a point. 15 coats of lacquer. Chris, that's a lot, isn't it? Or is it?
15 coats of lacquer sounds like a whole lot. And 15 coats of a polyurethane would be a lot. But lacquer is different. The vast majority of the elements inside lacquer are called VOCs, volatile organic compounds. Most of those are chemicals that allow the lacquer itself to be suspended in it, and they dry off, hence the 2-week drying period. And as the lacquer dries, what's left over is a very small amount of the amount that you originally sprayed on it. So this whole thing is absolutely super thin. In fact, a lot of the times when I see like manufacturers like Taylor, for example, talking about the thickness of their finish, this finish is just as thin, if not thinner, than those finishes. So
you've actually measured in the past, right?
Yeah, I've measured it in the past. I can't remember what they are, but I remember being happy that it was thinner than a Taylor finish. If you're new to the finishing world and you hear 15 coats of lacquer and you're like, oh my God, that's way too many. It honestly isn't. In fact, a lot of builders spray more than that. Plus, you have a lot of times when you're spraying where you're sanding off lacquer between it to apply more coats to get it smooth. So it's not 15 full coats. But I digress. What we ended up with is this guitar that you see here, and you can see that the finish is obviously not super glossy at this point. It has this kind of slightly matte, kind of eggshell look to it. What we did before we applied the last coat on this guitar is we sanded it to 1,000 grit and then put a lot of retarder in the finish so that it would sit really smooth. And what we have is a finish now that is not going to require a whole lot of work before we can get it over to the buffing wheel. But what we need to do now is wet sand it so that we can take it over there and take it to the buffer. And because we have such a smooth finish on here and it's not all orange peely like a lot of finishes are, we can go ahead and start off right with 1,000 grit at this point. So that's kind of the big thing that I would tell you if you guys are spraying your own finishes on your guitar, is right before you get it to the drying phase, you want this finish to be as smooth as possible, because if not, at this point, what we're going to end up doing is needing to do a whole bunch of extra sanding just to get it smooth. Well, we did all that work on the front end with the prep work, so we have this incredibly smooth finish. It's only going to require just a little bit of sanding with 1,000 grit, then we're going to hit it with 1,500 grit using a DA sander. We'll probably do a 3,000 grit. I know Matt and I a lot of times will do a 3,000 grit just to get it that much more polished, and then we're going to go to the buffing wheel and buff it out. But remember, and I've talked about this before in the last episode, you're going to do the work at some point. And in my opinion, you might as well do the work on the front end. So do the work on the front end, get it really smooth so that you don't have to do a whole lot of work now. And if you didn't do all that work on the front end, now you're kicking yourself because you have to do all the work, and that's not fun. So with that, what I'm going to do is start wet sanding this. Before we start wet sanding, one thing I did want to mention is there's a couple of spots right before we sprayed that last coat that I saw needed just a little bit of drop fill. And what do I mean by drop fill? What I meant by that is I put a little bit of finish inside a pipette like this. You can squeeze it and get a little bit of lacquer that comes out of the end, and you can actually hit spots where there are little pinholes or issues in the finish, and I let those things dry along with the whole finish. So what we have is some spots on here that are slightly higher, and I'm going to knock those down before we start wet sanding. And all you do is just take a razor blade. I like to put a little bit of tape on each side of it so that we don't cause any scratches or issues in the finish, and then we're just going to come on here and just very carefully kind of just help level out those spots so that the sandpaper isn't having to do all of the work. And that's pretty good. You're not wanting to take off a whole lot of finish here, just a little bit. And I know that we've got a little spot right here. And I'm bending the razor blade ever so slightly as we do this, just so that we're only hitting it in the middle. And this is leaving some small scratch marks on the finish, but that's no big deal. I think those are my only 2 little spots that we had on this whole guitar. So what we can do, I'm gonna flip this over because the back is the easier side to do. I have a spray bottle with some water in it and like 2 or 3 drops of soap, dish soap inside of it. You don't have to use the soap. I definitely recommend that you do though. It acts as a lubricant for the sandpaper and just it makes the sanding so much easier.
Makes it smell nice too.
It makes it smell lovely.
In a shop that routinely smells like BO and our
Yeah,
farts.
BO and farts.
Yeah, and sometimes sawdust. Yeah.
This smells lovely. What I do is I just hit this up with about that much water on it. Not a whole lot. I like to put a little bit on the end of my sandpaper as well, just so that it's ready to go. Make sure that your work surface is clean and nice and soft. That's why we have this towel here. Trying to think of anything else. Oh yes, something else that you need to be considerate of, depending on the type of guitar you're spraying, you might be doing an electric if you're following along at home, is water intrusion. Because we've got the water on here, if you have any places inside the finish, or if you've got like a pickup cavity on the guitar, where the finish ends and then you've got bare wood, you really want to be careful not to let the water just sit on there, because it will get wicked into the wood and show up underneath the finish, and it can create all kinds of issues. On the back of the guitar, I don't have to worry about that. On the front of the guitar, we obviously want to make sure we don't get a bunch of water down inside the sound hole. But yeah, with that, 1000 grit, a little bit of water and soap on the back of here, and we're just going to slowly start working our way across here. Because we're using 1000 grit, I don't have to be too careful of burning through all of this lacquer. If you guys are brave enough and you wanted to start out with like an 800 grit or a 600 grit, you need to be really careful not to burn through the lacquer. So yeah, let's get after it. Okay. That was the 1000 grit. I like to think of my 1000 grit when it comes to finishing almost as if the way that I would think of like a 60 grit. 1000 grit when it comes to this process is super coarse in my opinion. So you want to be quick with it. You don't want to spend too much time with it, because the more sanding marks you put in it with that, the more you're going to have to remove those sanding marks. But hopefully this will pick up on camera here with Matt. Can you see that on camera pretty decently or no?
Yeah, I got a
where you can see those slightly glossy spots?
Yeah.
We do. We have just some spots here that are just still slightly glossy, which tells me that they're not completely flat yet. But the most of it is very, very smooth. So instead of chasing my tail with 1000 grit, we're now going to switch over to the 1500 grit and get this totally smooth. So we'll spend a little bit more time with the 1500 grit. And as we step up with the sandpapers up to the finer grits and the finer grits, if we decide to keep going up, I always go longer with the next grit, and then the grit after that I'll go even longer with that one, because it just takes more effort to remove the sanding marks the higher the grit that you go. So we'll throw some 1500 grit on here. These are Klingspor sandpaper. If you guys don't know about the Klingspor, we'll put a link in the description. These things are absolutely amazing. We're not sponsored by them or anything like that. They're really great. Not very expensive. Made in Poland, where you know they're known for their sandpaper. All right, so 1500 grit. Same exact thing. It's going to put some more water on it, making sure that this is totally clean. You want to make sure you don't have any dust or anything on there, because if you do, or sawdust, you can easily grind those particles into the finish and create more scratches. So yeah, hit this with some rinse, repeat. Okay, this is looking really nice. We've still got the ittiest of bittiest of little low spots that have not been totally sanded down to absolutely smooth. I will say, you don't necessarily have to have those absolutely totally smooth, because we're still going to do another, we're going to do 3000 grit, and then we're going to move over to the buffer. So all of these things are going to be nice and smooth. Essentially what I want is on this step to remove as little material as absolutely possible, so that we don't risk any sort of burn through. So I want to get the minimum amount of finish on the guitar, and then I want to remove the minimal amount of finish from that before we buff it out, so that we end up with a really thin finish with as few of problems as possible. So let me grab my 3000 grit Trizact sandpaper, and we'll hit that up real quick, and then the back will be finished already. Okay, so I mentioned that we're going to do a 3000 grit. This is called, what is it, Matt? Trizact, we decided?
Trizact,
yeah, this is like a 3M based sandpaper that I actually get at my local O'Reilly's. auto parts store. I've had this for, God, probably 2 years now, and it works really great. It's almost just like a fabric. And they come in these rectangular strips, and I just cut them down so that they'll fit on here. And they do have hook and loop backs on them, so it kind of works out great. You can just put this on here. I switch out my sander so that it does it on a rotary setting. It just works better that way. At this point, remember, this is 3000 grit. We're not gonna sand through with this. We're essentially taking a t-shirt almost and kind of just, it's almost like right between sanding and buffing at this point. So new water, we've cleaned it off. We've got our 3000 grit on here, and we're gonna hit this up, take our time, just really kind of get any of those fine swirl marks out of it. And then this back will be completely finished. And what we should have when we're done with it is we will have gone from a totally satin look on here to a slightly semi-gloss. Not quite shiny yet, but you'll see it when we're done. Let's see what this looks like. Yeah, it's just starting to kind of be more of an eggshell look at this point. Really stoked with that, how that came out. I could spend more time on it if I wanted to get it even more perfect. But because we have a really good buffer and really good buffing compounds, I'm not too worried about it. So at this point, if you're following along at home and you're doing a buff out and you're watching this video for tips, it's really going to depend on how smooth you need to get this to go based off of what equipment you have for the next steps. If you're going to be polishing this guitar by hand, which a lot of folks do, you're going to want to spend more time with the sander, get this even more shiny before you move on. You might even go to a 5000 grit or even a 6000 grit, just to save yourself some effort. But at this point, for me, I feel really good because I know that my buffer is going to take care of any sort of micro scratches that we still might have in this. So what we need to do is we're going to flip this over, I think. Just double check. Yeah, we're going to flip this over and move on to the soundboard. So what I'm going to do before I just kind of start ripping on here like we did on the back is I'm going to put some tissue paper down inside, some paper towels down inside the sound hole so that we don't get a bunch of water and sludge down inside there, because if you get droppings of all of that, like this like residue there, it's so hard to get it out. So we're going to go ahead and drop some paper towels down inside there so that we don't have to worry about that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to go ahead and probably put some 800 grit on first, just so that I can hit those 2 spots that I had to do the drop fill levels, just to kind of get rid of some of those deeper scratches that I just put in it with the razor blade. But just ever so lightly, I'm just going to hit those with 800 grit, then I'll switch to 1000, 1500, then 3000 grit, and we're going to do the exact same thing, no different. So same process. Right, soundboard all sanded down to 3000 grit, looking super nice. I had to spend a little bit more time in those spots that we did the pore fills on, but they're absolutely, I don't even know where they were anymore. So that's exactly what you want. It's looking good. What we need to do now is switch to the sides of the guitar. And this can be a little bit more complicated if you're using a DA sander, just because it's hard to get into the waist area, especially if you have a cutaway on the guitar. But what I like to do is same method, 1000 grit, 1500 grit, then 3000 grit. I like to do this whole area here on the lower bout, and I'll come up around all the way to about here. We'll flip it over, we'll do the same thing here. I'll do the same thing on the upper bout. And then what I like to do is do the whole middle section here by hand, so I'll just put the sandpaper in my hand and get it done. But then what I like to do after I've gotten it all kind of roughed into 1500 grit is I'll take my hands and actually do the whole sides with the sandpaper with my hand instead of the DA sander. I don't know necessarily why I feel more comfortable doing it that way, but you can kind of feel if there's any issues in the finish at all with your hand that you can't with the sander. Maybe that's it. I don't know.
You're not worried about putting any low spots in from your
No,
hand,
not
like the
with
meat of your
1500.
hand?
Not with 1500 grit. I mean, like that's like it's almost construction paper at that point. And then because we do have the arm bevel, I will make sure that I hit this up as well. I still will make sure that I have paper towels inside the sound hole because a lot of times, especially in this waist area, it gets super sloppy and all that sludge kind of collects and then runs down and can drip into the guitar. So do make sure that you kind of have that protected and just be aware of it. I've gone ahead and drilled my hole for the pickup that's going to go in this guitar. So that's a spot that I am going to be cautious of making sure that we don't have any water intrusion into there. So yeah, those are the things that I'm thinking about. I do have some spots around the sides that I did do drop fills that I've gone ahead and hit with my razor blade. So those are spots that I just want to make sure to take a little bit more care with. But yeah, it's the same stuff. And we're almost ready to go over to the buffer now. So let me hit this with some more sander. Okay, we have all of the sanding done on this guitar. It's looking really good. We've got it all the way up to 3000 grit. So what we need to do now is buff this bad boy, and that's the whole point of this whole thing, right? What we are going to do is head over to our StewMac buffing wheel that we have, but I want to take just a second to acknowledge the folks that don't have a buffing wheel. You'll probably be doing this by hand using like rubbing compounds. What we like to recommend is either you get the 3M series of buffing compounds, which we only recently started using, and they're absolutely amazing. We've used the McGuire stuff. I know StewMac sells some great buffing compounds as well. Find yourself a single brand that has kind of like a coarse, a medium, and a fine, and maybe an extra fine, and stick with that. I like to use those wet buffing compounds even with my buffing wheel, but if you're doing it by hand, you want to make sure you get yourself a really good set of that, some good terry cloths, and a whole lot of patience and luck. I used to do all my guitars by hand, and you can get a good polish on a guitar. I guess technically you can get a perfect polish on a guitar if you do it by hand. It just takes a very, very long time. What I would recommend for folks who maybe are like, I don't want to get a buffing wheel, but I don't want to do it by hand, is get yourself an automotive buffer. Those work really well as well. Like the griots we've used before, not nearly as expensive as a full-on buffing outfit, and it's going to make your buff a lot better. So just things to think about. We'll put some links down below to some products that we think work really well so that there's some options for folks who aren't using a buffing wheel. But with that, let's head over there and get this thing looking shiny. All right, over at the buffing wheel, I have had this thing for probably 12, 13 years now. She's beat up. It's got this homemade like motor thing attached. It is definitely like a Industrial Revolution level of safety that's on this thing. Matt and I still have all 9 of our fingers from using it. All right, so what I like to do is not use this coarse buff unless I absolutely have to, because the method that I did at 3000 grit is actually a lot more polished than this coarse buff is going to allow us to do. We're actually going backwards if we were to use this. So I only use this if I have deep scratches, and I mostly use this side for buffing out fingerboards and doing fret jobs and things like that. So we're not going to use this, and what we're going to do is we're going to move over here to my fine buff. And anybody who does finish work who might be watching this video is going to be screaming at their TV, because I don't actually use the Menzerna dry buffing compounds on here. What I use is wet buffing compound, which so many folks like to say, oh, you can't do that, but we've recently switched to these 3M ones like I just said, and they work absolutely wonderful. So I start with number 1, then we do number 2 and number 3, and we can get this thing looking really good. And the reason why I like to use the wet compounds at this point is because it never ever in the history of me doing it this way has reintroduced scratches into the finish, because there's nothing more frustrating than doing all of that work that we just did with the wet sanding to get it super smooth, and then you come over here to the buffing compound and you've actually reintroduced a bunch of scratches, and then you're chasing your tail. So by doing this, I can go straight to the number 1 3M, and it's going to take this thing to basically a mirror shine, and the next two, number 2 and number 3, the extra fine buffing compounds, are just going to take it like beyond shiny, just like so that it looks like you're just dipping into the ocean. So I'll load my buff here with this coarse buff compound. I like to get it loaded up down inside of here. The first time I load up my buff, I have to really spend some time getting it packed down inside of it. Then I kind of, geez almighty, get it worked up into there, and then we can start buffing our guitar. And I'm going to do the back, so because that's dark and you guys will be able to see it a lot better than the top. But just remember, what we do on the back, we're also going to do to the top and the sides, obviously. So yeah, let me flip this thing on, and you will see it work its magic with a quickness. Let me do this. I want to show you guys what this thing looks like real quick. good. There's some swirly marks here that they can see. There we go.
Yeah.
All right, so you can see where I just really quickly hit this one spot here with that coarse liquid buff. And hopefully this is picking up, but there are some deeper scratches right here that are showing up that you couldn't tell until we took it to the buff. So that tells me what I actually do need to do is go over to the coarse buff, hit this really quickly just to get rid of some of those, and then come back over to this finer buff. That way it takes out those deep scratches. All right. Okay, so we'll load this up with some new buffing compound, but before I do that, I did want to take just a second to mention some method things. When you're buffing a guitar, if you're using a buff like this, you really want to make sure take care not to get too much pressure on the corners and the edges of the guitar because it's going to burn through really quick. This thing's not only buffing, but is actually heating up the finish as it buffs, and it's really easy to melt the lacquer if you spend too much time parked in one spot. You'll find that if this is your first time buffing, that you'll find where that sweet spot is between like pressure and speed to get it working really nicely. You want to have like a 50% overlap from every time you make a pass with the buffer so that you're kind of making sure you're not missing any spots. But the main thing is making sure you're not burning up any finish on the edges. And the other, and this is a super big one, you want to make sure that you don't ever buff in a situation where, let me see here, where, because this is coming down, you wouldn't want to buff this edge because what it'll do, it will rip this guitar out of your hand and choke slam it onto the ground in the blink of an eye. And you will have spent months building a guitar and then staring at it in splinters on the ground. And it happens so quick. So something that I'm constantly doing in situations where like I know that we're starting to get in a place where it might grab the guitar is I've got like a death grip on the guitar to make sure it doesn't get ripped out of my hand. So just be careful with that. So yeah, we'll put some coarse buffing compound on here so that we can hit the back of this guitar and get it looking really good. Okay, so I just got done doing the course. It's looking really nice. I can see that those little tiny swirl marks that I had are gone. So I'm not gonna spend any more time on the course. And now we can move back over to the side where I put the liquid compound on it. And we will be able to move on. We're just gonna go, once again, we're gonna go from the coarse to the medium to the extra fine of the polishes and get this looking really good. I'm gonna do the whole back before I move on to the sides or the top. That way you guys can have instant gratification. This is the internet after all. All right, so we've got the coarse liquid compound buffed onto this thing, and it's looking really good. So let's get Matt in here so you guys can see some of that glancing light reflection that we've got coming off of it. Mm-hmm. Before we switch over to the next level of fine buffing compound, what you're doing at this point is getting yourself some good glancing light so that you can check and make sure that there's not any scratch marks that are deeper than the next level of buff is going to get rid of, if that makes any sense. Because if you have scratch marks still visible at this point, you might as well not move on to the next buff. You might as well go backwards a step so that you can get rid of those scratches and then repeat that step. So it can be a little frustrating at this point because you feel like you're just kind of like going back and forth. But take your time, get those scratch marks out now, or you're going to regret it later, because once you get this thing fully buffed out, if you see a scratch mark, it's like, oh, you're going to have to start all the way over. And that does happen. So yeah, let's get the next finer level of buff on there. And it's looking really, really nice. And remember, this is worst case scenario as far as visibility of scratches because it is a black back and sides. But already so far, it's looking really, really wonderful. So moving on. Okay, I couldn't be any happier with how that came out. That looks really, really nice. Once again, the darker the wood, the harder it is to get it to look absolutely perfect. And this one looks dang near perfect. There might be some tiny little spots here or there that I'll go back and touch up over the course of the next day or two, but that's about as good as it can get with nitrocellulose lacquer. Really happy with it. At this point, what I need to do is do the exact same steps on the soundboard as well as the sides of the guitar, and then I will need to do the exact same steps on the neck of the guitar as well. But it's exactly the same process. Nothing's different about that. Other than the fact that the sides of the guitar tend to go a lot faster. That's because there's all these curves to it. So there's that, but I probably have another hour, hour and a half taking my time to get just the body done, and then probably about that much time on the neck as well. So we're not going to show all of those in this video because you've learned what you needed to learn from the back. The process is exactly the same. Big thing here is making sure that you're being very careful not to buff through or sand through your finish, because obviously, right, you don't want to go back into the paint booth. And then once you come over to the buffer, or even if you're using a hand buffer, just making sure you're not burning through there, and then taking the time to make sure that all of your scratches are gone before you move on to the next step. You always want to be removing the scratches from the coarser grit that you did right before that. And that thing translates over to the polishes as well. You have to think of your polishes as sandpaper. Yeah, the next time you guys see this guitar, it will be fully buffed out and looking really good. And then the next episode, we're actually going to be putting the neck on and getting the frets leveled. And we're like 2 episodes away from this thing having strings on it. We're really excited to get this thing to the finish line. And you guys are going to get a chance to hear what it sounds like. And with that, I think we'll call this one done, and we'll see you guys in the next episode. So appreciate you guys.